Dr. Trebuchet sighed, his breath fogging up the visor of his hazmat suit. He did a last-minute spot check, making sure he had his clipboard and pen. Then he reached for the shoebox, feeling its little occupant moving around as he lifted it up. The doctor turned as his newly appointed assistant, researcher Watchell, barreled into the room. The researcher was late. Trebuchet couldn't even imagine ever being tardy to his first assignment, but the Foundation were insistent on training up their new recruits as quickly as possible. The exposure to a mostly harmless anomaly would, in theory, help to normalize some of the stranger SCPs that the organization dealt with. Dr. Trebuchet held back a cheap shot about Watchell being so late, as the assistant researcher hurriedly clattered into his own hazmat suit. Both ready, they stepped through the decontamination airlock after it had hissed loudly, sterilizing the air and the outer layers of their suits. Then the two researchers continued into the containment unit. Even with their hazmat suits on, the differences in temperature and humidity were instantly noticeable, like the feeling you get stepping off a plane after a long-haul flight. The cylindrical glass enclosure had been perfectly climate-controlled, filled with wetland soil and stagnant water. It was like stepping inside a terrarium, a tiny little pocket of swamp large enough for someone, well, something, to comfortably live inside. That something was SCP-811, sometimes known colloquially by her nickname of the Swamp Woman. However, since bringing her into containment, SCP-811 had given herself a different name, which Dr. Trebuchet used when addressing the slimy creature. "Aye?" he greeted, causing SCP-811 to turn and face the Para-Foundation personnel. "Talkity what want?" she hissed. She had shown the capacity for communication, but possessed a limited vocabulary and struggled with the proper pronunciation of words. Dr. Trebuchet clarified he was there to ask SCP-811 questions, to which she quickly responded with a request for food. Opening up the shoebox, a frog hopped out, which the Swamp Woman quickly stomped on and began to eat the dead creature. Although, while she possessed a mouth, she didn't exactly eat in the sense that we understand it. Her body secretes a slimy mucus that, upon contact, causes a rapid rate of decomposition. Much like a fly, SCP-811 will vomit onto things in order to break them down, so she can digest their nutrients through absorption. She uses this ability both to hunt and as a defensive countermeasure against attackers, spitting out the waste of her food that collects in her stomach. Grinning at her own efforts, SCP-811 finished her meal and indicated she was ready to continue with questioning. Dr. Trebuchet handed his clipboard to researcher Watchell so that he could conduct the interview as part of his on-the-job training. "What is the earliest thing you can remember?" Watchell asked, reading from the board. "Earliest thing?" SCP-811 echoed, conveying that she didn't fully understand. Watchell stammered, unsure how to rephrase. "Early things," Dr. Trebuchet interjected. "Things before." "Before box?" A seemed to be understanding, indicating her containment chamber. Before box," Trebuchet confirmed. Appearing thoughtful for a moment, SCP-811 asked, "Most before?" Dr. Trebuchet nodded vigorously, telling her yes. Even though the Foundation had mandated this interview, he genuinely wanted to know how she had become like this. Immediately, SCP-811 gave sweeping demonstrative gestures with her hands and described in very vague levels of detail a man who had been taller than A herself, at a time when she was also much smaller. "Was like man," she said, pointing at her own arm. "What was like him?" Dr. Trebuchet probed, trying to clarify what she meant. In response, A pinched her mottled green skin, its surface slick with mucus. "This, not like A, like man, like people," she insisted. Her skin. She meant her skin had used to look human. Upon hearing the word skin from the doctor, SCP-811 repeated it, prodding at her arm, and then smiled. She'd learned a new word. When questioned further by Dr. Trebuchet, while Watchell felt increasingly uneasy nearby, the Swamp Woman pointed to the inside of her elbow. She described what she had experienced after this tall man had approached her. "Pain stick here. Cold," A said. "Needle, A." Dr. Trebuchet encouraged her to use the right word, certain she meant she had been injected with something. "They're called needles." "Needle here. SCP-811 tried to mimic the sounds of the word, before then going on to explain that she had experienced intense pain soon after. With her hands, she started miming that something had come out of her mouth. Red was very hungry. Ate man, skin like this. Hearing her describe, even in loose, broken terminology, what had happened to her became too much for assistant researcher Watchell. As far as both he and Dr. Trebuchet understood what A was telling them, she had been injected with something while still a child, and then had eaten the person responsible. Watchell, who had children of his own, couldn't help but imagine the same horrible act happening to his own kids, and the thought of it made him vomit in his hazmat suit. Given her own chosen method of attacking and dissolving prey, SCP-811 couldn't help that she interpreted seeing Watchell throwing up as an act of hostility. It alarmed the swamp woman, causing her to hurriedly retreat to a nearby pool of stagnant water within her containment chamber, refusing to reemerge until Watchell and Dr. Trebuchet had left. Angered by the assistant researcher's lack of professionalism and how it had interrupted the most coherent explanation of SCP-811's past, Dr. Trebuchet filed a dissatisfied note with the SCP Foundation. It read as follows. While I understand the appeal of training the new blood on something relatively harmless and as green as they are, could you please throw them at some other humanoid for a while, trying to actually get things done here? Had Watchell been able to stomach what he had heard SCP-811 saying, and probably through more extensive interviews with the creature, Trebuchet could have learned the full extent of how the swamp woman had come to be. She had been able to give the broad strokes of it, of course, but her descriptive ability was limited. The story had definitely fit with what the Foundation already assumed to be the case, that at some point, A had been human, but what they hadn't been aware of was the actions of this unknown individual, a nameless man, or what he had injected the young girl with in order to trigger her transformation. At any rate, the only explanation the Foundation had was the word of SCP-811 herself. It was vague at best. At worst, it might not even have been recalled with any degree of accuracy. She could have been lying, if she had the capacity to lie. And the specifics of who she was before, why someone had injected her, and what with were all still a complete mystery to the Foundation, and not just to them either. Given her partial comprehension, SCP-811 had long been suspected to have grown up as a feral child, a youngster abandoned when they were only a few years of age, rather than as an infant. It certainly seemed to explain her limited understanding of human language. The fact that she could communicate at all implied that she had at some point lived among other humans, but hadn't fully developed before her transformation. But even if she had been able to communicate at an adult level, SCP-811 still wouldn't have given the full story to Dr. Trebuchet. Not because she was keeping things from him, but because she simply couldn't. The trauma of growing up alone in the swamp, being turned into a monster, and everything else that had come before were all too much for her. She had at some point suffered a mental break, her mind shutting off the full details of her past as a defense mechanism. The swamp woman had been through far more and far worse than even she could remember. And unbeknownst to the girl who would later come to call herself A, the SCP Foundation had been involved. It had all started way back, a long time ago, and many, many miles away from where it would eventually lead to the birth of the Swamp Woman. Specifically, it began in Siberia. The SCP Foundation had learned of an infectious skin disease that had been discovered there by the GRU Division P, the Russian government's own anomaly containment organization. They had encountered a virus that was highly contagious and that would spread on direct contact with organic matter, but that was far from the extent of it. This infection would begin to transform its host, turning them into a horrific fleshy mutation that would attack any non-infected life form in an aggressive attempt to spread the virus further. The Foundation called it SCP-610, although the GRU-P troops had a different name for it. Roughly translated, they called it the flesh that hates. Now it was only through a combined effort between the SCP Foundation and their Russian counterparts in GRU Division P that this disease was contained to a single isolated area within Siberia where it had first been discovered. The Russian government at the time had agreed to keep the area under their watchful eye, and that anyone who became infected by SCP-610 would be killed immediately. Of course, nobody had accounted for the one who would get away. A Russian operative, a researcher within GRU-P, had become obsessed with SCP-610 since its discovery. The virus itself was horrific, producing abominable nightmares, but it could transform human physiology in mere moments, producing fleshy creatures that were almost unrecognizable as people. This scientist began to wonder if this transformative property of the virus could somehow be controlled, programmed even, then it may well hold the key to some of the greatest breakthroughs in medical science. He envisioned using it to grow replacement limbs out of tissue cells, or to trigger the reconstructive regeneration of bodily damage. The scientist just needed to figure out how to prevent SCP-610 from fully transforming someone. The only problem was, anyone infected with it was killed. So he took it upon himself to sneak into the isolated area in Siberia, where he could steal a sample of SCP-610 from the body of a recently terminated mutation, and he nearly made it away unscathed. The scientist's plans were quickly discovered by the joint effort between the SCP Foundation and GRUP. He had been requesting a sample through the official channels for months, and now he had taken one to experiment with and gone on the run with a new identity. Calling himself Alec Holland, the scientist fled the Foundation Russian agents sent to pursue him. As far as he knew, they were trying to prevent him from carrying out what he viewed to be a noble endeavor. But the Foundation knew that even if that tiny sample of SCP-610 was able to spread, it could cause a worldwide catastrophe. Whilst piloting a small plane, Alec was shot down over the swamplands of Louisiana. By the time Foundation operatives arrived in the area, all they found was a burning wreck. Little did they realize, Alec had been rescued by locals, who had taken him aboard their fan boat and rushed him to a hospital. He would later leave before his injuries had fully healed and return to the site of the crash to discover something curious. His sample of SCP-610 had been cross-contaminated with the swamp's stagnant water, teeming with algae and who knows what else. Alec was running out of time. He knew that if his wounds didn't kill him, he would soon be discovered by the Foundation and GRUP. Using a syringe, he gathered up the combination of the virus sample that had mixed with the natural properties of the swamp. There was no way of knowing what it would do, whether it would still mutate a person, or whether the disease's transformative effect had been altered. But he had to know, and he was living on borrowed time. Desperate, he raced to the nearest town, a tiny community near the swamp. Alec told himself that the first person he encountered would be his test subject. He had to see what effect this altered version of the virus would do to a human being. It just so happened that the first person he encountered was a little girl named A, and he wouldn't live long enough to see the full extent of what he was about to turn her into. Now go check out SCP-173 Origin Story, how SCP-173 got to Site-19, and SCP-053 Young Girl for more mysterious anomalies.